The night my son introduced me to his business partners, he laughed when he said my name. Not a warm laugh. Not the kind a son gives when he's proud. It was the laugh you use to lower expectations, the kind that says, "Don't worry, he's nobody important." He put his hand briefly on my shoulder, the way you'd rest your hand on a piece of old furniture you haven't thrown out yet, and said, "This is my dad. He used to fix things around the neighborhood. You know, odd jobs, that sort of thing." The table smiled politely. I stood there in my gray blazer, the one my wife had ironed that afternoon, and I nodded and said it was nice to meet everyone. I did not correct him. I did not fill in the gaps he had deliberately left empty. I simply picked up the glass of water in front of me and took a slow sip, and I looked out at the Vancouver skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the restaurant he had chosen to impress these people. I had been to this restaurant before. I remembered when the building it sat in was still a construction site. But I said nothing. I just sat down, folded my napkin across my lap, and I waited. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I am 63 years old. I was born in a small town outside of Thunder Bay, Ontario, and I came to Vancouver when I was 22 with $400, a used pickup truck, and a trade certificate in electrical work. My father had been an electrician. His father before him had worked the mines. We were not a family that spoke much about money, but we understood the value of showing up, of using your hands, of finishing what you started. I met my wife, Carol, when I was 26. She was working the front desk of a small accounting firm, and I had come in to fix a broken circuit panel in the back office. She made me a coffee without being asked, and left it on the counter beside my toolbox. I married her 14 months later. My son, Patrick, was born when I was 29. Carol had a daughter, Renee, from a previous relationship, and I adopted her when she was 4 years old. Patrick and Renee grew up in the same house, went to the same schools, fought over the same television remote. I never thought of one as more mine than the other. As far as I was concerned, they were both my children. Full stop. What I built over the years, I built quietly. That is the only way I know how to work. When Patrick was in elementary school, I was running a small crew of 3 electricians, mostly residential contracts around Burnaby and New Westminster. By the time he was in high school, I had 14 employees, and we were doing commercial work, office buildings, small industrial sites, a few government contracts. I kept the office in the same industrial unit I had started in. I drove the same kind of truck I had always driven. I wore the same kind of clothes. Carol used to joke that I looked more like a foreman than an owner, and I took that as a compliment. I never talked much about the business at home, not because I was hiding anything. Carol knew everything, every contract, every hard year, every good one, but because I genuinely believed that what happened at work stayed at work. Home was home. Dinner was dinner. I did not want my children growing up thinking money was what made a man worth listening to. That belief, I realize now, had consequences I had not fully considered. Patrick had always been sharp, quick with numbers, good at reading people, confident in a way that I admired even when it made me slightly uneasy. He went to the Sauder School of Business at UBC, graduated near the top of his class, and spent 4 years working for a real estate development firm downtown before deciding to launch his own company, a property technology startup software that streamlined permitting and contractor coordination for mid-sized developers. I thought it was a good idea. I told him so. When he came to me in the early stages and asked if I might know anyone in the trades who could give feedback on the product, I made a dozen phone calls. When he asked if I knew anything about construction permitting workflows, I sat with him for 2 weekends and walked him through everything I had learned over 30 years. I did not invoice him for the consultation. I also did not tell him that I had quietly invested a significant amount of money through a numbered company to help him get through his first funding round. I asked the lawyer to keep my name off the paperwork. I wanted Patrick to be able to say, truthfully, that he had built something himself. I did not want him to wonder later whether his success was his or mine. Perhaps that was a mistake. Perhaps I was too careful about staying in the background. By the time Patrick was 32, his company, he called it ClearPath Solutions, had grown considerably. He had moved into a real office in Yaletown, hired a proper team, and begun attracting attention from larger investment groups. He had become, by any reasonable measure, a success, and I was genuinely proud of him. But somewhere in that process, something had shifted. The more successful Patrick became, the more I noticed that he began to speak about his background in a particular way. When he introduced Carol at events, she was my mother, a retired financial administrator, which was technically accurate, though she would have called herself a bookkeeper. When he introduced me, the description had a way of shrinking. At his company's first anniversary party, I was my dad. He does maintenance work. At a charity golf tournament the following summer, I was my father, semi-retired, used to work in the trades. At a dinner with a university friend's family, I was just my old man. He's a handyman type, very handy with tools, and people had laughed warmly at that. And Patrick had smiled, and I had smiled too, and said nothing. Carol noticed. She mentioned it once, carefully, on the drive home from the golf tournament. I told her it was fine. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "Is it?" I told her I was still deciding. The dinner that changed everything was in October, about 14 months ago now. Patrick had been in serious talks with a group of investors, institutional money, the kind that would allow him to expand ClearPath across Western Canada and eventually into the United States. The lead investor group was represented by a woman named Margaret Cloutier, who ran a mid-sized private equity firm based in Calgary. She and her husband, a man named Bernard Cloutier, had arranged a dinner at the restaurant on the 38th floor, the one with the view along with two other investor couples, Patrick's business partner and their respective partners. Patrick had called me the week before. He wanted Carol and me to come. "It'll look good," he said. "Family-oriented, grounded. Margaret likes that kind of thing." I told him we would be happy to come. Carol bought a new blouse. I had my blazer cleaned. We arrived a few minutes early. The private dining room had a long table set for 14, low lighting, candles, a view of the North Shore mountains going dark against the sky. I remember thinking it was a genuinely beautiful room. Patrick met us at the door. He looked polished and confident, which made me proud. He gave his mother a long hug. He shook my hand and said, "Thanks for coming, Dad." Then Margaret Cloutier and her husband came in, and Patrick moved to greet them, and I found myself standing slightly to one side, holding my coat, until a staff member came and took it from me. The introductions went around the table gradually as people arrived. Patrick introduced Carol gracefully, warm, clear, a small story about her meticulous eye for numbers. When he came to me, we were standing in a small cluster near the window. Margaret Cloutier was there, and her husband Bernard, and one of the other investor couples, the Nakamuras from Victoria. Patrick put his hand on my shoulder. "And this," he said, with that easy smile he had perfected over years of client dinners, "is my dad, Gerald. He's been doing odd jobs and home repairs around the lower mainland for as long as I can remember. Very handy man to have around," he chuckled. "Honestly, growing up, if something broke in the house, Dad was the guy. He'd show up with his toolbox and sort it out." Mrs. Nakamura smiled warmly. "How lovely. There's something so solid about a man who works with his hands." Her husband nodded. "My own father was a carpenter. Honest work." Bernard Cloutier laughed pleasantly and said something about how everyone wished they had a good handyman on call these days. I smiled. I said it was nice to meet everyone. I let the moment pass. But Patrick wasn't quite finished. He was warming up to the room, feeling the approval, and he leaned in slightly and added, "Dad's kind of the quiet type. Keeps to himself, doesn't really follow the business side of things. But he's always been great with a set of wrenches." Another small laugh. The table responded warmly. I looked at my son's face. He was not being cruel, I told myself. He genuinely did not think he was doing anything wrong. He had told this version of his father's story so many times that he had stopped noticing what he was leaving out. He had constructed a version of me that was safe, that was humble, that served the story he wanted to tell about himself, the self-made man, the first-generation entrepreneur. And that version required a father who was simple and small. I picked up the bread roll from the plate in front of me, and I said nothing. Through the first hour, the conversation moved around the table in the way these conversations do at business dinners, easy, careful, each person showing their best side. Patrick spoke fluently about the growth of ClearPath, the size of the market, the timing. His business partner, a young man named Tyler, added data when needed. The investors asked intelligent questions. I ate my salad. I answered when spoken to. "Mr. Nakamura asked me if I had done much work in the construction sector, and I said yes, quite a bit. He asked whether I found the permitting process as complicated as the software made it out to be, and I said that, in my experience, The inefficiencies were real and had cost people I knew a great deal of time and money over the years. He nodded slowly and said that was useful to hear. Patrick glanced at me briefly from down the table, a faint look of surprise, or perhaps mild concern, that I had said more than a single sentence. The main course arrived. The conversation shifted. Bernard Cloutier began asking Patrick about how ClearPath had handled its early funding rounds, who had believed in the company before there was much to show. Patrick said it had been a real grind in the beginning. He talked about pitching to angels who turned him down, about the long months of uncertainty, about the commitment of his small, early team. He did not mention the early investment that had come through a numbered company. He did not know it had been me. Margaret Cloutier had been quiet for a while. She was a compact, precise woman in her early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of still attention that suggests someone who has spent a career reading rooms. She had been listening to Patrick carefully, but her eyes had drifted, more than once, to me. She waited for a natural pause in the conversation, and then she said, "Gerald, forgive me, but I want to make sure I have this right. Your last name is Whitmore?" I said yes. She set her wineglass down. "Whitmore Electrical? You're the Gerald Whitmore who started Whitmore Electrical contracting in Burnaby in the early 80s? The table stilled. I said yes, that was right. She looked at me for a moment with an expression that I found difficult to read. Then she said, "My first office, my very first office, when I was starting out, was in a building on Kingsway. We had an electrical fault that kept triggering the fire suppression system. We called 3 contractors, and none of them could find it. The building manager finally called a crew from Whitmore Electrical." She paused. "You found it in 4 hours. A grounding issue that had been misread by everyone else." I remembered the building. I didn't say so immediately. She continued, "I have followed Whitmore Electrical ever since that day. When you sold the company, in what was it, 2019? I remember reading about it in the business section. It was not a small transaction." The room was very quiet. Patrick was looking at me. Bernard Cloutier said slowly, "Whitmore Electrical, you're the company that did the electrical systems on the Pearson Tower project and the Canby District redevelopment?" I said we had worked on both of those. "Yes." Mr. Nakamura had put down his fork. "My firm used your company for 2 commercial builds in Victoria in the early 2000s. Your site supervisor, a woman named Deborah, she was extraordinary. We requested her by name after the first project. Deborah Chen. She had been with me for 17 years. I told him she had retired 2 years ago and that she was an extraordinary person." Patrick had not spoken. His face had gone through several things in a short period of time. I watched him find a version of himself and hold on to it. He said, quietly, "Dad, I didn't know you'd sold." I looked at my son. He was 34 years old. He had built something real, and I was genuinely proud of him. And he did not know who his father was. I said, "You never asked?" It was not said with anger. I want to be clear about that. There was no triumph in my voice, no edge. I am not a man who takes pleasure in other people's embarrassment, and I had no wish to embarrass my son in front of the people he needed to impress. I said it the way you state a simple fact, because that is what it was. Carol, sitting across from me, had folded her hands on the table. She was not surprised. She had known this moment would come, in one form or another, for a long time. Patrick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you ever tell me? I mean about all of it?" I considered the question carefully. I had thought about it for years. I said, "When you were growing up, I didn't want you to think that the number in a bank account was what made a person worth respecting. I wanted you to see a man who worked hard, who kept his word, who came home every night. I thought that was the most important thing I could give you." I took a sip of water. I may have overcorrected. Margaret Cloutier made a small sound that might have been a laugh. She picked up her wineglass and said, "Patrick, your father's company had, at the time of sale, over 200 employees, a safety record that was cited as a provincial benchmark, and a client list that included half the major institutional developers in British Columbia." She looked at him steadily. "I think you may have been underselling him." Patrick looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked down at his plate. A complicated series of things moved across his face. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. The words were quiet and they were real, and I believed them. I nodded. I told him we would talk properly, the two of us, when there was time. Tonight was his night, and I had no wish to take anything from it. He had built ClearPath with his own intelligence and his own persistence. and those things were genuinely his, regardless of any early investment I had made. The dinner continued. The conversation changed in a way that was difficult to describe. The air in the room was different. The quality of the attention directed at me was different, and I found that people asked me questions for the rest of the evening with the kind of curiosity that had not been there before. I answered what I could. I tried not to say more than was necessary. But at one point, Bernard Cloutier leaned across toward me and said, in a low voice that was still friendly, "Why on earth did you let him introduce you that way?" "For the whole evening?" I thought about it for a moment. Then I said, "Because I wanted to see what kind of room I was in, and because I wanted my son to know that I don't need a room to change its mind about me before I feel comfortable in it." Bernard looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded slowly and refilled his wineglass and said nothing more. Patrick and I had the conversation he had promised about 2 weeks later. We drove out to Lighthouse Park and walked the trail down to the water, the way we used to when he was younger. It was a cold November afternoon, and the Douglas firs were enormous and still around us, and the sound of the ocean came up through the trees. He told me that he had genuinely not known the full scope of what I had built. He said that the story he had carried in his head, the father with the toolbox, the quiet handyman, had become so fixed that he had stopped asking questions. He said that every time he described me to new people, the description had felt like a fact instead of a choice, and he had never stopped to examine it. I told him that I understood that. I told him that I had also made choices that contributed to the gap between us, that my silence about my own work, taken too far, had become a kind of withholding, that I had been so determined not to be the father who used money as a way of demanding respect, that I had accidentally become the father whose son didn't know him. We walked for a while without speaking. The ocean was gray and vast, and the kind of cold that clarifies. Then Patrick said, "Were you angry that night, when I introduced you as the handyman?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "I was sad. There's a difference." He thought about that. He said, "Why didn't you just tell me? Years ago?" I said, "Because I kept waiting for you to ask. And I think I kept thinking, if I have to tell you, does it count?" He stopped walking. He looked at me. Then he said, "Dad, you should have told me." And he was right. That is the thing about pride worn the wrong way. It looks like humility from the outside, and it feels like self-sufficiency from the inside. But sometimes it is just another way of keeping your distance, of protecting yourself from the risk of being known by your own children and found wanting. I had been so careful not to impress my son with what I owned that I had neglected to let him know who I was. That is a lesson I carried forward. Renee, my adopted daughter, came to see me the following weekend. She had heard from Carol what had happened at the dinner. She sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea and said, "Dad, I need to ask you something." I told her to go ahead. She said, "Did you ever feel like Patrick didn't respect you?" I said, "For a while, yes." She was quiet. Then she said, "I've always known who you are. I hope you know that." I reached across the table and took her hand and said that I did. And I meant it. Whatever had been unspoken between Patrick and me, there had never been any question between Renee and me about what we were to each other. I had chosen her as surely as she had chosen me, and in many ways that conscious choosing had built something that blood ties alone cannot guarantee. I am not telling this story because I want credit for what I built. I spent 35 years building it, and the building itself was its own reward. The crews I worked with, the problems we solved, the buildings that still stand in this city because the electrical systems inside them were done properly and with care, those things do not need a dinner party reveal to mean something. They mean something because they are real. I am telling this story because of what happened that night, and what it showed me about the quiet ways we lose each other in families, not through dramatic betrayal, not through cruelty, but through the gradual accumulation of small silences and convenient assumptions and stories that stop being examined. Patrick had built a version of me that was easy to carry. I had allowed it because I thought I was being humble. Neither of us was entirely wrong, and neither of us was entirely right. What I know now, at 63, having lived through the kind of business failures and recoveries and grief and unexpected grace that a full life contains, is this: the people who love you deserve to know who you are. Not just the version of yourself that is uncomplicated and requires nothing from them, but the real shape of your life, the work you did, the things you are proud of, the years you struggled and did not quit. Letting your children see you fully is not vanity. It is a form of honesty. It is, in fact, a gift. And to any parent who has been quietly underestimated by someone they raised, I want you to hear this clearly. The measure of a good parent was never in the title on a business card or the balance in an account. It was in every school morning you got up for, every worry you sat with in the dark, every time you chose to show up when leaving would have been easier. Those things are not diminished because a table doesn't know about them. They are not made larger when the table finds out. Your value does not depend on being recognized, but it also does not depend on staying invisible. There is a quiet dignity in honest work done well, and there is also a quiet courage required to let the people closest to you see it for what it is. Both things are true. We do not have to choose between them. Patrick runs a good company. I believe it will grow into something he will be proud of for the rest of his life. We have dinner now, the four of us, Patrick and his partner, Carol and me, every few weeks, and we talk about real things. And he asks questions about the years before he was paying attention, and I answer them. It is not everything we lost, but it is something genuine that we are building now, together, which is perhaps the only kind of building that matters in the end.